Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Luohan Webinar. It's Xijie from Luohan Academy. And today we are very happy to have Professor Johannes Stroebel from NYU Stern to talk about the automation and racial disparity in small business lending. Professor Johannes Stroebel is a professor of finance at the NYU Stern School of Business and also a fellow of Luohan Academy. He conducts research in climate finance, household finance, social network analysis, macroeconomics, and real estate economics. He has won numerous awards and fellowships, including AQR Asset Management Institute Young Researcher Prize, the Bradley Award for Best Paper Published in the Journal of Finance, Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, and Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship in Economics. He's also associate editor at the leading economic journals, including Journal of Political Economy, Review of Economic Studies, Econometric, and Journal of Finance. So without further ado, please join me to welcome our speaker today. Johannes, the floor is yours. Please take it over. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. And just to check, we have 75 minutes, right?
Usually it's 90 minutes. Yeah,
90 minutes.
You can,
okay.
You
Perfect.
can.
Yes. So I'd love to make this as lively as possible. So please feel free to interrupt at any point in time. I probably won't be monitoring the chat very actively, but if you just unmute yourself to interrupt me, if you want to turn on your camera, feel free to do that as well. So this is a joint research project with two colleagues here at NYU, Sabrina Howell and Teresa Kuchler. Jun Wong, who is currently a graduate student at the University of Chicago, but was a pre-doctoral research fellow with us at NYU, and David Snitkoff, who's an employee of Ocrolus, which is a fintech firm that's one of the data providers for this specific project. The starting point of the idea for us for this project was to kind of, from this observation that there's been long-standing concerns about racial disparities in lending outcomes in the US. I think you hear about similar concerns all over the world, but that's sort of the rates of getting loans and the interest rates that you get on loans sort of differ, across racial groups substantially. And in recent years, there's been a debate about the role that fintech lenders in particular can play, either in terms of amplifying or in terms of reducing these disparities. So in terms of amplifying, people have highlighted that sort of complex pricing algorithm, machine learning models might actually lead to more statistical discrimination, might actually lead to more disparate outcomes across racial groups than sort of non-fintech banking practices. On the reduction side, there's at least a number of channels through which automation as part of the the fintech lending process might actually allow you to mitigate or reduce some of these disparities. At least three of them are sort of obvious to us. So the first one is that fintech lending has just much smaller fixed cost of making given loan, right? You don't have a branch network, you don't have as much human involvement, and so as a result, fintech lenders have the ability to serve smaller businesses, right? With a smaller fixed cost, and to the extent that some of these smaller businesses are disproportionately owned by minorities, fintech lenders might have a better ability to serve minorities at sort of given their cost structure. The second reason is fintech lenders originate largely or exclusively online, and as a result, they can serve a broader array of locations. Traditional lenders, working through a branch network, their ability to serve location depends on the footprint of their existing branch network. But to the extent that those branch networks might be less developed in high minority areas, the traditional lenders might, as a result, struggle to serve these higher minority areas. And fintech lenders, by being online, having an equal ability for anyone to apply there, might sort of mitigate disparities. And then lastly, and maybe most controversially, fintech lenders through automation remove human decision making from both the loan processing and also the loan approval process. And to the extent that we think some of the racial disparities we see are the result of actual discrimination, so somebody looking at two loans and either, and in particular due to preferences across different, racial groups, deciding to serve one group over another. By removing human decision-making from the process and therefore removing these biases from the process, fintech lenders might also reduce discrimination, right? So overall, again, the complex algorithms has been put forward as a reason why fintech lenders might actually exacerbate the disparities. And then, the sort of by having lower costs, by being online and removing humans from the decision-making, people have proposed that it might mitigate disparities. And so what we're going to do is we want to study the ability of automation. And in particular, we're going to focus on the second set of bullet points. We're going to try and study the ability of automation to, to mitigate disparities, across racial groups in lending outcomes. And we're going to do that within the setting of the Paycheck Protection Program. So the Paycheck Protection Program was a huge federal program in the US, one of the largest programs ever put out. And it was a program that was put out in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So when COVID hit, same, like you guys were facing over the last 6 months, a lot of businesses had to shut down overnight, no more, all restaurants, all like private schools, all hairdressers, all of these businesses had to shut down overnight. And in order to stop these businesses from closing, the federal government put in a program that by the end had reached more than $800 billion of loans to these small businesses. Loans is kind of an interesting term here because the idea was that if you were going to use these PPP funds for either making rent or for making payroll, so basically keep paying your employees even though they don't show up to work, they would be forgiven. And the vast majority of these loans that were made in the the COVID period have been forgiven already, right? So it's really a grant to small businesses, but it was structured as a loan that would be forgiven if you use it for rent, payroll, etc. There's sort of two really important features, and I'll talk about this program a bit more in a few slides. But there's a few features that make it really special for studying this specific question. The first one is that within this program, lenders, so the program was a federal government program. It was administrated through the existing lenders, right? So the federal government doesn't have the infrastructure to go out and and make $800 billion worth of loans. And so what they said to the banks, you go out and make those loans, but you're not going to be responsible for default on these loans, right? So these were going to be entirely risk-free loans, but they were sort of processed through the traditional infrastructure of either the traditional lenders or the fintech lenders. What's nice about the risk-free nature of the loans is that it'll allow us to drill down to the extent that we're going to end up seeing any racial disparities in outcomes. It is going to remove sort of any concerns about unobserved credit quality or features like that as drivers of any observed disparity, precisely because there was absolutely no credit risk to the original lenders. It's also that the loan amount was predetermined by characteristics of the business. So it was something like 2.5 times the payroll you had prior to COVID or something like that, right? So there wasn't a lot of adverse selection on loan amount or any of these types of issues. And in fact, the money that the banks would get for making these loans was also predetermined, right? So it was, every loan of a certain size made the banks the same amount of money, and there was no default risk any. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just to kind of start out with, this is going to be a very desirable feature of this program in for the specific question that we're about to study. Now, just one thing already to point out. I'm going to be focusing on the role of automation and the role that automation has in terms of potentially reducing these racial disparities. Precisely because there was no default risk in these loans, there was also not sort of the traditional loan underwriting that that you might expect for a more traditional loan, and therefore the role of these complex algorithms leading to more statistical discrimination is also not a feature of the setting that we have here. So we're really going to focus on the automation part rather than the sort of machine learning, bigger data part in terms of leading to potentially more statistical discrimination, right? And we think that's a strength of the setting rather than confounding lots of different factors within sort of within a given setting, allowing us to really drill down on those on those automation effects. And then within this setting, we're going to ask two questions. The first one is, a descriptive one, which is, what are there any systematic racial differences in loan outcomes across, say, different lender types, right? Really trying to understand, okay, some of these racial disparities that we observe in other settings, which are more complex and involve credit risk and all of these others, do we continue to see similar similar disparities within this specific setting we have here? And then secondly, what is the role of automation in explaining these settings? Really trying to understand sort of, these sort of 3 bullet points we have up here: lower fixed cost, online presence, and reducing human decision making. What role do they play? Give you a brief overview of the finding. And the headline here is that we're still going to find very striking disparities across different lender types in lending to different racial groups. So we're going to find that Black-owned businesses disproportionately, to the extent that they obtain a PPP loan, they disproportionately obtain their loans from fintech lenders. Now, interestingly, 2/3 of the unconditional difference that we observe in the data is explained by observable characteristics, right? So it's explained by business location, it's explained by business size, which again will translate into loan size. And so that provides evidence that the ability of fintech lenders to make smaller loans and to serve different areas contributes to their ability, or to the lower sort of racial disparities you see among the fintech lender. Sort of, thinking back to these 3 bullet points, I think we're going to find some evidence in favor of 1 and 2. But more importantly, I think, is that even conditional on the controls, Black-owned businesses are still much more likely, and here we're talking about 12 percentage points more likely, or about 70% more likely, to obtain their PPP loan from a fintech firms. Much of this comes from being less able to get PPP loans from smaller banks, right? Amongst top 4 banks, these are sort of, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and Citigroup. You actually don't find substantial amounts of racial disparities. And importantly, these differences, the ability of, the probability that a given firm would obtain their PPP loan from a fintech lender rather than a local small bank is much larger in areas with higher racial animus. What do I mean by racial animus? I'll talk more about it, but just at a high level, it is going to be a measure of spatial variation in how much sort of racial tensions there are. And you can measure this through a variety of things. So one of the methodologies, for example, uses the use of racially charged search words on Google to look, to try and measure sort of implicit biases. There's also direct measures from implicit association tests and other things like that. So there's a variety of ways that we're going to proxy for spatial spatial differences in largely anti-Black racial animus. And it's exactly in those regions where that anti-Black racial animus is large, is when you get sort of these small businesses, disproportionately Black-owned small businesses, disproportionately borrowing from fintech lenders rather than other firms. And then
Johannes?
Yes.
Sorry, can I interrupt
absolutely.
one question?
Yes,
So,
please.
Fintech lenders and traditional banks are in different stages at the moment. Maybe during the COVID time, they really want to use this opportunity to expand their business or expand their customer base. So that gave them additional kind of incentive to serve those kind of underserved communities, right?
So I think that is correct. But to the extent that part of what you worry about is the traditional banks. So I guess what you're saying is, once fintech lenders might be at scale, they might no longer have that incentive, rather than this being something inherently different about the process that fintech lenders have. So let me actually go to the next slide to try and provide more evidence that I think this is really something fundamental about the automation process, rather than something that's, it's just, they just want to grow and this was the best area to grow. Which is, we want to try and understand, and sort of the thesis we have in this paper is that it is exactly this. It's the automation of the fintech lending processes that play a big role here. And so what we do is we, in order to provide evidence for that, in addition to what I've shown you and some additional things I'll show you when I actually walk you through the results, we're going to exploit the fact there was a subset of these small banks. Remember, these small banks were on average the lenders that had the least likelihood of extending PPP loans to Black-owned firms. And most small banks have very manually intensive processes with loan officers and so on, right? Precisely those processes where, the types of, racial biases might actually play a role in the lending process. But during the PPP period, the loan amounts or the applications at both small and large banks were many, many multiples of normal loan volume. Right. So, while normally you might get 1 or 2 applications from a small business a week in a given bank branch, during the COVID and PPP period, there might have been hundreds of applications. Now, what that means is that for banks that remained manual in terms of their loan processing, there were huge capacity constraints, and somehow they had to decide how to prioritize. And our story is that even though there weren't any differences in default risk, some of these, racial biases let the loan officers to prioritize, applications, from non-minority owned businesses. But what's important is that a subset of banks decided that, wow, the loan volume is so big, we're going to automate our processes during the PPP period. We're seeing this huge flow of applications. We can't process this. We're going to work with sort of, white label fintech firms to give us a back end to allow us to also automate our processes. And so what we're going to do is we can look at a difference in different specification where we look lending by the same bank throughout PPP, and we know exactly when they started automating their loan processes. And we can show that small banks, after adjusting to automation, so again, it's the same bank with the same strategy and everything, except they decide at some point to say, wow, rather than kind of not being able to process most of our applications, we're going to automate our processes. After automation, their share of loans to Black-owned businesses increases substantially. And moreover, this effect is substantially larger in areas with higher anti-Black racial animus, right? So this really seems to suggest it's not something inherent about the bank or the stage of its business or something like that, but when the same firm changes within our sample how they deal with these applications from manual processing to automated processing, lending to Black-owned firms goes up a lot, and it goes up particularly in those areas where we found prior evidence for these higher tensions. We're also going to look at a few other possible explanations that you might think might also explain some of the observed differences. One of them is, our thesis is that this is really about something that's happening at the bank side, right? To at least a sizable extent, something about the decision-making processing process at the banks. You might have also thought, and a completely plausible alternative story is the differences in equilibrium lending outcomes might as well be driven by differences in the application behavior of different businesses rather than differences in, approval rejection or something like that, right? So you might have said, well, maybe it's the fact that Black-owned firms are just much more likely to apply to fintech firms. And, and then that's really what's driving observed equilibrium differences. So what we're going to do to rule that out is we're going to work with a sample of loans that apply to a fintech platform. So unlike for the normal PPP data, which I'll talk about, in 2 slides, where we only observe originated loans, for this sample here, we observe all applications. And it's actually particularly interesting, which is that this firm will quasi-randomly route these applications to different lenders. So you apply through this platform, but the platform doesn't actually make loans itself. It just takes those loans and then forwards them to different lenders. And, there is sort of a sizable element of randomness involved in which lenders gets it. And so what we can show is that when Black-owned businesses, when their applications through this platform get forwarded to a conventional lender, who then kind of actually, again, engages to some extent in manual processing. And Black-owned firms are actually less likely to get a PPP loan at all. But this holds, again, application behavior fixed. While if a Black-owned business application gets forwarded to an actual fintech lender through the platform, there's no differences in their probability of getting a loan. Right? So this tells us 2 things. First of all, it tells us what we observe here is not, at least not entirely, but also not largely, driven by the application behavior. And then secondly, it tells us that the whatever it is that we're finding has actual real outcomes, right? So it's not just, well, everybody gets a loan from someone, and it's just the black-owned firms get it from a fintech lender, and the non-black-owned firms get it from a conventional lender. But in the end, everybody gets a PPP loan, so who cares, right? It's just like, what, it doesn't actually matter a ton who your lender is. But it actually shows that no, this, whatever is driving this disparity that we observe actually has real effects on the rates of getting a PPP loan at all. And if you remember what I said before, these aren't really loans, these are grants, right? This is just money that the taxpayer gives to some business and not others. These racial disparities in PPP loan outcomes will actually lead to very large racial differences in real outcomes. Right?
May I ask
yes.
a question?
Yes, please.
So I wonder whether the grant feature of the program also affects the external validity of the inference. That is, if a lender believes, mistakenly or not, that the things they discriminate against, racial feature or others, helps to predict default risk. That may be a mistaken belief. Right? If they believe so, they normally would try to find a way to program that into their screening process, automated or not. But since in the feature of this program is that there's no consequence of the default, so that they don't need to do that. Wouldn't that mean that the conclusion here might not be generalized to other fintech programs in which lenders may believe they have a reason to do that? Yeah.
But I actually think this goes the other way, right? So if you go back to sort of this first slide here, right? This is in some sense this first bullet point here, right? You're trying to predict default. And, it's illegal to put race directly as a predictor in, but you can put in other things that are correlated with race. And so this is why people have this concern that complex algorithms might lead to more statistical discrimination, right? And so you might have said, well, and so here we're shutting that down for the exact reason we have, right? It's not actually the grant nature that shuts it down. It's the fact that there's no credit risk in these loans, right? So if the person actually defaults, like if the person actually uses the money for something else or whatever it is, the bank isn't on the hook. The bank gets that money from the government either way, right? And so what this means to us is that it shuts down one key channel for racial discrimination that you observe in many fintech programs, which is you're using something that's correlated with race to predict default, and that's why you're getting differences in outcome. It shuts that down because there is no default risk in these loans. There is no underwriting in these loans. And so the fact that you still see these large differences means it can't just be. So in some sense, what I'm saying with external validity is I agree with you that in other loan programs, one might expect even larger differences. Right? We might expect even larger differences because once you start including these statistical discrimination concerns, you're going to layer on top of the sort of of the types of things that we're talking about here, actual racial discrimination due to preferences, not just statistical discrimination. Right? So that's the way I think about how this translates to others. It's a setting that is different from other settings, in the sense that it doesn't have default risk, but that should in any case push us away from observing discrimination or disparities. The fact that we still observe it, but what's nice about it is the feature that it has in common with all the other loan programs you might think about is that the processing of the loans is going to be very similar, except you cut out the underwriting stage. But loan officers deciding which businesses to follow up with when they're missing documentation, just as one simple example of a stage where even if there's no default risk, businesses have to provide certain information to process the loan. What was your payroll? And if you have 100 applications and only time to process 5, which ones are you going to follow up with and which ones you're going to not? That's something that you hear about as a key stage where loan officer preferences and biases might play a role. I might decide to follow up with the ones that look like me rather than the others, and I guess that one still carries through here. And so I view the fact that it doesn't have default risk actually as a strength, because it really allows us to isolate what's going on here. Usually as you know well, in an economics or finance seminar, when you present anything where there are racial differences in outcomes, people always say, yeah, but maybe this is just statistical discrimination, right? Maybe this is just that loan performance differs across these groups in an unobservable way, or in a way that isn't captured by FICO score and so on. And so maybe that's what's going on. Now, it's actually illegal to do statistical discrimination also in the US, but it's much harder to prove. The point I'm saying here is let's take that out. The fact that you still find a big difference suggests that even that explanation for most of what you see can't be the entirety of the story.
Johannes?
Yes.
I can ask a clarifying question.
Sure.
So for the rejections, do they need to specify why they reject the application? So I thought everything is automatic.
So you mean with the second bullet point with the fintech platform. So the way this works with the fintech platform is the application gets sent to a lender, but actually the conventional lenders that get sent the application, they then still have to do some manual work to actually process it. Now, we don't observe whether or not there actually was a decision to reject. Most of these I don't think were rejected. Most of these I think were just never acted on. Right. So if you read the newspapers around this time, the lenders were like, in particular, conventional lenders were completely overwhelmed. Most of them were getting 100 times their normal application volume of small businesses. And so they were entirely overwhelmed. And so people have these stories of spending all weekend in like a phone line trying to talk to someone to get their loans approved. It was particularly bad because, the program had initially a cap. Initially it was, I think it was $300 billion, then it got extended to $800 billion. And so everybody was racing to get their application processed before the program ran out of money, right? And so this is really, it's not, I don't think I don't think the common thing here is people went through all the process and in the end decided no, because everybody was eligible. And, if you go through the effort of actually collecting all the pieces and looking at it, you might as well process it because you get an origination fee as a bank. So you'll get paid for every loan you originate and you have no risk for doing it, right? So you wouldn't actually put in all the effort, then look at it and then say, I reject. So I think it's really more about, I'm a loan officer. I have 300 applications on my desk. I have to start somewhere. What is the process that I'm deciding on which ones I'm going to start with and which one I'm going to be not? And I think that's where some of these racial biases, I think, play a role here.
All right, thanks.
Okay. All right. So let me talk a bit more about the Ppp program. I think some of these things we've mentioned already. Some of it in response, in response to the question. So. Again, the PPP was put in March 2020, so this was 2 weeks into sort of the big COVID shutdowns in the US. First loans were given as early as April 2020. The program went through May 2021, though it had these different tranches. In total, there are just under 12 million loans granted with more than $800 billion. So this was one of the largest public finance programs in the US. After Biden got elected, there were very substantial changes to the program. So in February 24th, the program decided to specifically target lending to minority businesses. So that kind of complicates our interpretation of what you see in the data. And so we're going to focus on lending prior to that date when there were no specific mandates, in terms of extending these loans differentially across groups. The loan amount was fully determined. So it was just 2.5 times monthly payroll. That was the amount of loan or grant that you would get. And what that means is that all these types of adverse selection concerns that we sometimes have about, loan amounts don't play a role here. I already mentioned that loans were fully forgiven if used for qualifying expenses. So this is if you used it for rent, if you used it for making payroll, a bunch of other expenses too, it would eventually be forgiven. And as of November 1st last year, more than 3/4 of these loans were forgiven already. And, the vast majority of the others we expect to be forgiven. So it's really a grant. And so it turned out to be really valuable to get this money. But for the reasons I mentioned, because the government did not have any capacity on, in terms of processing and administering 10 million or 15 million loans very, very quickly, what happened is that the government decided to have the actual loan applications processed and administered by private lenders. And that's going to be really important for us because, for the reason that, Zhang Jin mentioned, we really, we don't just want to learn about a specific program. We're hoping to learn something that has an extent of external validity, parts of this process that would carry on and teach us about lending more generally. And I think, the fact that it was processed and administered by private lenders and the same loan officers that would handle other loan applications and so on, I think gives us that. But there were two big differences. The first one is that lender compensation was just based on the loan amount. You would get a fixed share of whatever the loan amount was. There's a little bit graduated. So for smaller loans, you get a slightly larger share and so on. But the money the bank would own wouldn't be on interest, wouldn't be on anything else. It would just be on the loan amount, right? So this is, again, kind of the question I think Hong Yung asked. You know, once you actually go through, there's certainly no profit reason to reject an application, right? If you give it to the government and it meets the criteria and you've checked it meets the criteria, you'll get a fixed amount of money and you have no risk. Right.
So I think on that, can I ask a question? So yes. Now I understand. Previously, I misunderstood. So you are comparing PPP loan with automation versus PPP loan without automation. I was equating PPP loan with automation, which is not right. Okay. Yes. But on the profited themes, I wonder whether the PPP loan can nonetheless essentially subsidize existing lending relationship. That is, yes, previous loans without the additional loan can go sour. So lenders have an interest to reinforce existing lending relationship. So I wonder whether you have information on whether the automated lenders versus non-automated lenders, whether their existing borrower pools are different or not.
So here's the thing. So I completely agree with you. It's a very, very perceptive point. It's one we think about a fair bit in the paper. I'll have some more to say. The answer is this is not what's going to be driving the result. What we do find, and I think this is an important one, we do find every bank prioritizes their customers, right? So if you go to a bank and you say, I want to, I want to get a PPP loan. I already have a checking account with you, or I already have some other loan or whatever with you. You're more likely to get a loan from that bank than otherwise. And that makes a lot of sense. I think there's one reason is exactly what you said, right? You're like, well, okay, I'm going to give them the PPP money, and that reduces the probability of loan default on my other exposures I have to them. The second story is just like, I have more information about them already, right? So say if they have their checking account with me, I can check payroll very much more easily than if it's a completely new lender. There were also very minor, like, anti-money laundering, etc. type procedures. So like onboarding a new client was a little more complicated than sort of a client where you'd already done some of the, anti-money laundering, know your customer type checks. So we do find that, but I'll show you evidence that that's not what's driving the racial disparities. The racial disparities actually all come from the subset of people who don't get a loan at their checking account bank, but who apply to a different bank, right? So these are people, generally both the white-owned and the black-owned businesses, without existing relationships at the banks, where they, so it was really amongst new applicants at a specific bank where we see the racial differences on average come in. That's a little subtle, and I think you're probably where I'm going to be in about 30 minutes into the 30 minutes further. But yes, it is not going to be the pre-existing banking relationships, that you very rightly point out as one possible explanation. Okay, so again, the central thing here is the loans were 100% government guaranteed. And so there's really minimal risk for lenders, even if there's default and even if there's fraud, right? So actually when the loan came out, when the program came out, the primary objective of the government was to get as much money into the pockets of small business owners as possible. Now, ex post, this program looks overly generous, and there was actually a lot of fraud in the program, right? But the government explicitly in the law wrote that lenders will not be held responsible for fraud by the borrower. So if the borrower files a fraudulent application and the lender approves it, we will explicitly say it's not the lender's problem, because they were exactly worried that the lenders will say, look, we need to be careful, do small, but this was, the economy was shut down, these small businesses, everyone was out of work, unemployment rate was 25%, 30%. And so they were like, look, let's worry about fraud later. Let's just make sure we get money into the pockets of people, right? And so the law explicitly held lenders, not liable for fraud of the borrowers. Okay, so what's the data we're going to use to do this? So this is we're going to combine, a lot of different data sets here, but the baseline data set is actually a great data set, for anyone working in banking, which is that that the SBA, the Small Business Administration, has publicly put out data on every single PPP loan that was granted. They didn't actually want to do that, but there was a Freedom of Information Act request, and the court ordered the SBA to release data on every single PPP loan it granted. And so a lot of the newspaper articles you might have read, like uncovering sort of various types of frauds in the PPP program, is basically journalists using this public data and going through all these firms that that got these loans. Overall, we have about almost 5,000 unique lenders in here, and you have some information on loan amount, the exact identity of the borrower, the industry, and the organizational form of the borrower. Now, in order to to look at racial disparities, you actually need to know the race of the ownership of the of the business. And so what we're going to do is we're going to match the businesses in the PPP to state business registrations. So this is the first fintech firm we collaborate with, Middesk. Middesk basically collects Secretary of State registration forms of business, and they will have the the identity of the owners. And so talk on the next slide, we're going to use a race prediction mechanism to identify the identity of the owner. We're going to have bank statement data from Ocrolus. So this will, for example, allow us to look at pre-existing banking relationships that Jen rightly pointed out is something we need to look at. We're going to have credit and debit card revenue data from a firm called Enigma. So every small business that processes its revenue through, say, Visa and MasterCard and so on, Enigma collects a lot of that data. And then we're going to have PPP applications to this platform called Lendio. It's another fintech firm. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of applications, and this is where where we can hold fixed, that an application sort of randomly gets forwarded either to a fintech or to a conventional lender, and sort of can rule out that we have, sort of differential application behavior as a key driver of what's going on. Okay, so how are we going to identify borrower race and ethnicity? So some borrowers will voluntarily self-identify their race in their PPP application. But the problem is it's a quite highly selected sample, right? So you only have that for, I think, like 5 or 10% of the sample. And so what we're going to do is we're going to predict race from the name of the owner, from their name and other observable characteristics. This is something that's that's been done in many other settings, so we're not really inventing anything new here. We're just taking a technology that's been done. So what we're going to do is we're going to predict the race based on the last name and the location, and then we're going to train a random forest model on self-identified borrowers, where we take the posterior from this race prediction algorithm together with information on industries and so on. And so overall, we'll be able, for about 4.2 million loans, predict the probability of a business owner being of a certain race with pretty high certainty. Now, this algorithm will achieves a very good performance within a holdout sample of self-identified borrowers, right? So within the sample of people that in their PPP application self-identify their race, we can predict those very well. We also redo all of our analysis just looking at the sample of self-identified race. There's about 1 million of the something like 8 million loans or something that you have, or 10 million loans that you have altogether. We also use a different algorithm from another firm that does this. There's obviously going to be prediction errors and classification errors in here, right? So there's going to be some businesses that where we're going to say this is most likely a Black-owned business or Hispanic-owned business based on the name, but it turns out that this prediction algorithm is wrong. I actually think that in many ways, for what we're looking at, the signal that comes from the name and the location is actually more interesting to study than the true self-identified race. Why? Well, if I'm a loan officer and I'm trying, and I have exactly this issue, I'm trying to decide which loans to process first and which ones to process last. I don't actually know what the owner self-identifies as in terms of race. What I know is the exact same features of this prediction algorithm, right? So I know the name, I know the location, and so sometimes they also have other inputs. So they had to send in a photograph of their driver's license. And so if you actually start looking at the picture, you can get additional, potentially additional race information from that. But the first thing you would get is, an application that has the name of the owner. And so my sense is that actually, an owner that, like a white business owner with a black sounding name and a black owner with a black sounding name might actually be treated very similarly by a potentially biased loan officer, because they don't know the true race. All they have is the same information. There's a lot of interesting work already in the literature around exactly this idea of people doing racial discrimination based off information that they infer from names. So the famous Bertrand and Mullanesan paper, are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? That's the exact idea behind this, right? So this was an audit study where they sent CVs around, and the only thing they varied was whether or not it was a very white sounding name. Names that, the posterior probability after hearing the name is that this person is white, Emily and Greg, or whether or not the posterior probability after seeing the name that the person is black, Lakeisha and Jamal. And they showed that basically, only changing the name, people will make these types of racial inferences based on the name, and then will discriminate based on their inference, right? So that makes me think that even though we don't know the true race of the applicant, we only know the signal that's contained in things like name and location. That might actually be the relevant dimension to think about discrimination in a setting where the loan officer quite often has never met the applicant and is just looking at the paper form and the very same information that we use to train our algorithm.
What's the fraction of a small business loans that's applied in person?
I do not know that. It's not something that we observe in the data here. So unfortunately, I can't tell you that. But I would expect, for in particular the small banks, where we're going to see the most disparities amongst the conventional lenders, I would expect it's still a sizable amount that, people would actually show up at their branch and they would say, and so it is true that I think a lot of these lenders might have additional information. I think the fact that that the signal is pretty strong, in the end, it doesn't make a huge difference, right? So again, if we just use self-reported race, where we're not using any of the prediction, any of the signal, we get very similar results. So I don't think this is sort of an issue with what we do. And again, one might even think that it's kind of, there's a story where this is the relevant thing you'd want to look at, the signal rather than the true race. But to be honest, they're pretty highly correlated, and it doesn't really make much of a difference. You find very similar results using either of the two.
Hi, since you mentioned small banks, can I ask a quick question about the small banks? Which is it possible that the small banks just have a lot more geographic dispersion, in that there are some small banks that are very overrepresented in minority neighborhoods, and there are some small banks, and maybe those are a fewer set of small banks, and there's a lot of small banks that are just not represented at all in minority neighborhoods?
Yes. So I think that is correct. So what I'm going to show you is exactly, Randy, it's a good question. I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to start out on the next slide with just an unconditional difference in racial disparities. And then I'm going to show you that the location of the firms, which is going to be correlated with the location of the lender, explains some of it, right? So the gap between lending to Black-owned businesses, between small banks and fintech lenders, for example, goes down after you condition on the zip code of the applicant, right? But I'll still show you that a Black and a white-owned firm from the same zip code are still differentially likely to borrow from a fintech versus a conventional lender. And in some ways, I view this as one of the ways in which fintech lenders can reduce disparities, right? This paper isn't entirely about discrimination. Active discrimination is one of the aspects through which automation, can reduce disparities. But the other one is exactly the story you have, right? Traditional branch networks, we know, are less dense in high minority areas, right? And so by being automated and being online and everyone can apply, equally from anywhere, that's one of the ways in which fintech brings more banking services to these, minority neighborhoods that are traditionally underserved by conventional lenders. So so in some sense, that is going to be part of the story. And, again, if you think back to sort of the three different reasons that I said, why can automation help? The first one was it has a lower fixed cost. So you can lend to smaller businesses. And if minority businesses are smaller, you're going to bring in more marginal minority businesses. The second one was location. Exactly this. It's exactly the story you have in mind. I think that comes on top. But even after controlling for all these, some role remains for discrimination, right? So I really think there's evidence for all three of these ways through which automation can help reduce disparities. One of them is through reducing discrimination, but the other ones is, reducing the fixed cost and therefore being able to serve smaller businesses, and then being able to serve businesses equally across space without having to rely on your existing branch network, which we know is less dense in high minority areas. We could spend a whole day talking about, is that also because of discrimination or not? Why do the small banks not have more branches in high minority areas? We're just going to take that as given without taking a strong stand on what's the source of it. But certainly fintech helps by offering services in places where there aren't a lot of bank branches, and therefore there's less opportunities to interact with traditional lenders.
Johannes, do you have
Yes.
information on the racial background of the loan officers or the distribution? So
I do not. I do think that would be a very interesting thing. In fact, I've seen a paper recently on mortgage lenders, and that looks at exactly this, and the evidence they find, I think, is to some extent consistent with what I think is where you're getting at, which is if you have a minority loan officer, does the probability of lending to black and white owned borrowers, this is in the mortgage setting, change? In this data set, I do not have that. So yes, but it would. I think it would be a good question, and I think it'll be very interesting.
But I seem to remember there's a study on taxi drivers getting tips from customers with a different racial background. There's some interesting, surprising findings there as well.
Yeah, so I think generally my read is on the discrimination evidence that, this is not just racial discrimination, this is gender discrimination and other settings too, that people from the discriminated groups also sometimes discriminate.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like it goes away. I think it generally gets a bit smaller, but I think a reasonable prior might have been, well, if you're a black loan officer, you will stop this, you will be, it'd be a huge difference relative to a white loan officer in terms of your lending behavior. I think, we see this across a huge range of issues, just something from a completely different setting where I think you see very similar features, which is, teaching ratings, between men and women. I mean, you've seen people have done experiments where, they do online teaching and you actually never meet your teaching assistant in person. You only ever interact with them online. And sometimes they get a male name, sometimes they get a female name. And then in the end, you ask them to give reviews. It's completely randomized. And, you get lower reviews for the women, even though it's exactly the same behavior. And you get lower reviews from women, even when it's the women giving the reviews, right? So again, I don't think discrimination goes away entirely when, the specific person making the decision is from the minority group or from the group that's discriminated against, but I think it gets smaller. But anyway, that's beyond this, what we can talk about with the data we have in this setting here. Okay, so let me just show you some unconditional data to start out with, right? So this is the first conditional probability I'm going to show you. So this is the probability of a loan being to a black-owned business conditional on the originating lender type. So what you can see at the bottom here is that more than a quarter of all PPP loans by fintech firms go to black-owned businesses, while only about 3% of PPP loans from small banks go to black-owned businesses, right? And you're going to have sort of other banks in the middle. I'm going to really kind of conceptually, I want you to focus on small banks with the smallest share, then the larger banks, which is sort of in the middle here, your JP Morgan, your Wells Fargo with an intermediate share, and then fintech with a large share. Now, we can look at the different conditional. What's the probability of a certain lender being the originated lender conditional on the loan being black owned? And what you can see is that over half of all fintech or of all PPP loans to black owned businesses were made by fintech firms, right? Even though fintech firms only make about 17% of all PPP loans, they make over half of the PPP loans to Black-owned firms. We also look at other racial groups, but really the disparities of Black-owned businesses is much more striking, and so that's what we're going to focus on, in this specific presentation. But these are just raw averages, and I think Randy's question and other questions have been already hinting is that Black-owned businesses differ obviously on observable characteristics. The most important one that they differ on is loan size. Black-owned businesses are just much smaller, and remember that loan size was just a fraction of your payroll or multiple of your payroll. It was 2.5 times payroll. So if you're a smaller business, your PPP loan is going to be smaller. And remember that banks were compensated with a fixed percentage of the loan amount. So it was more desirable for banks, even putting race aside, completely aside, it was more desirable for banks to make loans to larger businesses than it was to make loans to smaller businesses, right? And so given that that is the case, you would expect if I'm going to prioritize and have a bunch of loans, then have to pick which ones first, I'll process the large ones first. And the large ones happen to be disproportionately from white-owned businesses rather than Black-owned businesses. So it ends up that I'm prioritizing white-owned businesses, but not because they're white-owned, but just because they're larger and I'll make more money on them, given sort of the incentive structure in the PPP system. Now, the mechanism we discussed before, about why fintechs might be able to overcome this is if fintechs have fewer capacity constraints, right? Because in some sense, you don't need a loan officer to look at every application. It's all automated, right? That's kind of this benefit of automation. Or if they have lower fixed costs, then the story is that they could profitably serve more small businesses, which are more likely to be Black-owned, right? This is not about discrimination; it's about disparities, right? But it's not necessarily about discrimination, right? So that might be one mechanism through which automation might help. The second one is exactly what I think Randy mentioned, which is banks are more likely to serve areas in which they have a local presence, right? That's makes a lot of sense, and we know that bank branches traditionally have fewer branches in minority neighborhood, and so so it could be that the benefit of fintech firms to allow borrowers from everywhere to apply might be another reason why why they help with getting these PPP loans to those minority-owned businesses. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to control for these differences, and what you'll see is that the unconditional gap declines, right? So it does suggest that some of this potentially is coming from fintech's ability to serve smaller businesses and to serve businesses across all locations. But really the central thing is going to be that a sizable part of the gap remains, right? Even after control for location, even after controlling for firm size. And again, what's really central is loan size is the only determinant of the probability of the profitability of the loan. Once I control for loan size, every loan of the same size makes the bank the same amount of money. Right, so often you have, you control for some, with empirical work. Now, often we have this concern. Yes, you control for some things, but there's others that you can't control for, right? And so, how do I know that any remaining gap isn't the other things that you can't control for? And the way I think about that is, it's like, it depends what these other things that you can't control for are. But in this specific setting, centrally, none of them can be about the profitability of lending. Because the profitability of making the loan is entirely pinned doing by the loan amount. And again, I view that as that's not going to be the case in other settings. As you guys, Zhang Jin and others have pointed out rightly, it's not about like other loans. There is default risk and so on, and you'll never be able to proxy for everything that captures default risk. But here, because there's no default risk, once you control for loan size, you really have this benefit of fully controlling for the entire profitability of making the loan. Okay. So that's these results here. So this is a regression. I'm going to just on the left-hand side, I'm going to put an indicator variable for the type of lender. So for example, an indicator variable whether or not the loan is made by a fintech lender. And I'm going to control for all these types of things. So I'm going to control for loan amount, fixed effects. And again, that's going to pin down near perfectly the profitability of actually making the loan. We're going to control for zip code fixed effect, so that's going to control for the availability of the branch network as one possible explanation. We're also going to make sure that these are loans that were made at the same time, and we have a bunch of of other controls here too. And what you can see is that Black-owned businesses are still 12 percentage points more likely to get their PPP loan from a fintech lender than other businesses with the same loan amount, same zip code, applying at the same time, and so on. Overall, as we said, the probability of getting a PPP loan from a fintech lender across all firms is only about 17%. So this is a huge increase in the probability of getting a PPP loan from a fintech lender. And this is kind of, again, comparing loans in the same place. You can also interact these fixed effects and so on. It really makes no big difference. When you look at top 4 banks, conditional on these controls, there's very little effect on the probability of getting a PPP loan from a top 4 bank. So once it's an applicant with the same loan amount from the same zip code at the top 4 banks, you don't get a big difference. Where you do get a big difference is at the small and medium banks. So at the small and medium banks, Black-owned businesses are about 8 percentage points less likely to get their PPP loan from them, right? So the difference, again, I'm just focusing largely on this big gap between fintech and and small and medium-sized banks. The gap remains even after you control for loan size and location. But again, I think this controlling for loan size and location here, and the fact that the gap goes down as part of that, is part of our story. Like, I do think part of the reason automation helps fintechs make more loans to minority-owned businesses is because the lower fixed cost and the lower, and the decline in capacity constraints allows them to just make more loans to smaller and therefore more minority-owned businesses in a way that has nothing directly to do with discrimination. Okay, so now I want to try and figure out whether or not these effects that we've seen, trying to provide additional evidence that these effects that we've seen are really due to the role of automation rather than other differences that you might expect there to be between fintech lenders and non-fintech lenders, right? That I really want to nail that. I think what we're seeing here is the automation part of the fintech lenders. And what we're going to do is going to start out, what led us to automation? It's this idea of, trying to figure out what do fintechs and top 4 banks in common with each other that you do not have at smaller banks. And it really is this sort of substantial automation in the loan processing and approvals process, right? The fact that, there's also this difference between the large banks and the small banks. The large banks also have largely automated processes by now. It's really the small banks that they do not. And in fact, early on in the PPP program, the small banks were kind of proudly talking about the fact that that they were doing all this manually, right? So this is an article that talks about how a community bank served small businesses and the manual process prevailed, right? It says, look, the Piedmont Bank reviews some automation solution, but in the end, they decide to process the loan applications manually, the PPP ones. Everyone who works there is preparing to put in long hours and a lot of elbow grease. They know they're going up against the big banks and their automated systems. And then this was like, the small business association, the small bankers association, community banker association saying this, it's reminiscent of the folklore of John Henry, the steel driving man who competed against the machine with manual labor. So they were kind of proud of the fact that they were doing this manually, even though they were competing against the automated ones. But you can imagine in these long hours that they were putting in, and they just have this huge pile of applications on their desk, they have to decide somewhere where to start, right? They can't process them all in parallel, right, if you do it manually. And so that's really the stage at which I think the discrimination aspect comes in that automation removes. Now, kind of facing this big thing, it says the Piedmont Bank reviewed some automation solutions, right? They decided to stay manual. Most decided to stay manual. But importantly for the research design of the next step is that during the PPP, and to cope with this just ballooning application volume, some banks decided to automate their PPP processing through collaborations with white label software service providers. So basically, these are firms like Biz2Credit, or Numerated or firms like that. And basically what they do is they can basically go to a bank's website and you can just plug in their back end. And, and people can start going to the small bank's website and put in their PPP loan details. And you basically automate a lot of the things like, a lot of the checks that you would otherwise have to do manually. And so what we were able to do is we've worked with Biz2 Credit to identify 20 banks that automated their processes during the PPP process. And we worked with Biz2 Credit to get launch dates of their services to PPP banks, and also we try to identify some additional banks through newspaper articles like this one here. There were also articles about, hey, I'm using Numerated since last month, and so on. And so what we can then ask is we can now just focus on small banks, right? And we can ask whether or not lending to Black-owned businesses increases after the automation relative to lending to Black-owned businesses at other non-automating banks, right? So this is basically a diff analysis, tracking the same bank over time. One automates, the other one does not, and trying to see whether you see a change in the rate of lending to Black-owned businesses at the same bank after automation. Right? And so this is what you see in this graph here, right? So it looks like pretty parallel pre-trends. So in the period prior to automation, the trends of lending to Black-owned businesses between those banks that eventually automate and those ones that do not were very similar. But after the automation event, the rate of lending to Black-owned businesses at the banks that automate goes up, right? And so that makes us sort of more confident that it truly is the act of automation that that has some effect on the ability to lend to Black-owned businesses, not just some other difference between fintech and non-fintech firms, right? So this is the same. Yes.
Can you also know the extent of automation? Maybe some banks automate more, you're gonna see a stronger effect.
Yeah, I wish we had that data. It took us a very long time, and like getting these software service providers to give us any data on who their clients are and like when they use their product and so on was very difficult. So so unfortunately not. We really just know, like, are you working with Biz2 Credit? But the sense is like, at least the like data entry and data collection part is automated. That we know for sure. I wish we had more variation in this. I wish we had data on more banks that automate. I'm sure there's more than the ones we've been able to identify. But it's just a data challenge we have here, right? So how much does lending to Black-owned businesses go up? Remember, on average, small banks only made about 4%, 3.7% of their loans to Black-owned businesses. For those banks that automate, after automation, this goes up by something like 5 percentage points. So it more than doubles the rate of lending to Black-owned firms amongst small banks after the automation event. That also tells you a little bit that it can't be entirely driven just by application behavior, right? Unless you get that, prior, when the bank didn't automate, Black businesses didn't apply, but after automation they do, which is not completely inconceivable, but it's hard to make this to be entirely about the timing, right? It has to be that that these small banks kind of were getting or are getting applications from Black-owned businesses. It's just they weren't prioritizing them. Once you automate, and both the decision which ones to do first, is taken out of the hands of humans, but also the need to prioritize, because the entire point of automation is to increase your processing capacity substantially. So maybe you can now, after the automation, you can now actually process all of the loans. These things kind of make me relatively confident that that we're really picking up the causal effect of automation here on the rate of lending to Black-owned businesses. Okay, so here is here is the a little bit of a summary of what I've shown you so far. So we've argued that automation can mitigate disparities through three things: lower fixed cost, which allows you to serve smaller businesses, and we find evidence for that because controlling for the loan amount does reduce racial disparities. Automation can mitigate disparities through being online and therefore serving a broader array of locations. And I think we find evidence for that because controlling for location does reduce disparities. And then largely we argue that it can do it through eliminating human decision making, which actually reduces the amount of active taste-based discrimination. And so the next part that I want to show you in this paper is I want to provide you direct evidence for reduced discrimination. Right? I want to show you sort of things that are like directly related to that. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to ask the question whether or not we're going to find larger disparities, where we're going to find more anti-Black sentiment. Now, I mentioned this before, that we'll try and find a whole range of different measures of anti-Black sentiment, right? So we're going to use, racially charged Google searches as one of them. We're going to use implicit associations tests. So these are like tests that, social psychologists have developed. So they will like show you a picture and you have to decide, they'll show you a picture and then they'll ask you to kind of, select good or bad as words, and and basically they try and back out your implicit biases by saying how quickly can you decide whether something is good and bad depending on the race of the person you see in the picture and things like that. So it's a whole sort of a whole field trying to create these tests. We're also going to use just general measures of segregation, spatial segregation, in areas where Black and white people live in very different communities rather than when they live in similar ones. What's important is that in all of these, the rate of Black-owned businesses borrowing from fintech loans is disproportionately larger in areas where you have higher racial animus. So this is consistent across all of the measures we look at. For every single measure, in areas where we find evidence that there's more racial animus, we find Black-owned businesses to disproportionately borrow from fintechs, and you also find that those are exactly the same areas where their rate of borrowing from the smaller non-top 4 banks is particularly low, right? So that's that. Now, what we also do, remember that automation result we had. We said after small banks automate, their rate of lending to Black-owned firms goes up. We also find that that effect is particularly large in areas with more racial animus, right? So automation has the effect of increasing lending to Black-owned firms, particularly in areas where we think there's more racial tension. And again, that's consistent with one of the things that this automation does, being reducing the ability to directly discriminate, right? So that's kind of
racial tension. Sorry, this racial thing happen at the zip code level, or
no? So it's not the zip code. No, it's not the zip code level. Most of it is actually at an even larger level. So it would be at some of it is at the county level, and some of it is at the metro area level. So the Google searches, for example, are at the metro area level. So you're comparing Atlanta to, to Savannah or something like that. Yeah, I mean, the exact level of geography at which this happens is, it varies by the measure, but nothing is at the zip code level, and certainly not below the zip code level. You really want to think county level as being the geographic variation that we have here. Okay. So again, do we have direct evidence for this third mechanism that more automation by reducing human decision making and reduce discrimination? And we think we have pretty strong evidence, because disparities between fintech and particularly small banks are stronger in areas with higher animus, and also the effect of small bank automation is larger in these areas. And so, we think that, that kind of makes us pretty confident that at least one part that why automation helps reducing disparities is by reducing discrimination. Okay, so then I think the last parts of the paper are really sort of trying to try and rule out other stories that you might have had once I show you the unconditional disparity. Some of them you guys have brought up already, that could also have explained what's going on. And we really want to just try and, we've now presented evidence for, I think, the story that we believe in the end is the key driver, but now we need to show other ones too. So first one is we want to understand application behavior. And, the story we were worried about is one, it's a possible story where, Black-owned businesses are more likely to apply to fintech lenders, right? And that's the reason why they would end up being more likely to end up borrowing from fintech lenders, not because the traditional lenders don't want to lend to them, but because the minority business don't want to borrow from them. Right. And you could imagine two stories for this. One of them is if you thought that Black-owned businesses were just more tech savvy, something like that. But you could also think that they're just more distrustful of the traditional banking system. Both of those would lead you to differences in the application behavior. And all I've shown you so far was data working with equilibrium outcomes. Who actually ends up borrowing from whom? I haven't been able to do very much on the application. So that's where we're going to go next. How are we going to do that? We're going to get data from from these PPP loan applications from this platform called Lendio. Now, again, as I mentioned before, Lendio doesn't make any loans itself. It's just a platform. And what it does is it will refer the applications to partner lenders. And, we observe which lenders each application was sent to. We don't observe directly in the Lendio data whether or not the application was approved or rejected by a given lender. So what Lendio does is it collects some of the data, puts it together, and then sends it to a lender. And that's generally where Lendio ends. But we can match the applicants to Lendio to the final PPP data on all of the loans made, right? So we can check whether or not the application was actually processed and originated by one of the lenders that Lendio sent it to, whether it was originated by no lender, or whether it was originated by a lender that's different to the one that Lendio sent it to, right? What's kind of central here is the fact that, referrals aren't entirely random, right? So some lenders might say, please only send us, loans of a certain size or something like that. But conditional on basically loan size and geography, it's random which lenders get sent to. So once we condition on loan size and geography, we can basically exploit the fact that which lender it ends up with is quasi-random. Okay. So we're going to assume that an application is rejected if a business applied via Lendio. Lendio sends it to at least one lender, but the business never ended up getting a PPP loan. And as I said before, rejected here really is a combination of either looking at the loan and actively collecting data and then actively deciding not to originate, or it's like what's called a soft reject, which is I'll just never touch the application. So I won't actually tell the borrower, sorry, I've rejected your application. You're just never going to hear back from me. Okay, so what we can then do is we can basically look at, I'm going to put now on the left-hand side, I'm going to put an indicator variable of whether or not a firm that applied via Lendio and where Lendio forwarded the application to at least one lender, whether or not they don't ever end up getting a PPP loan. At baseline, this is actually a pretty high rate. So overall, about 35% of all people that applied for a PPP loan through Lendio never got a PPP loan, either from a Lendio lender or from anyone else. What's interesting is that unconditionally, a Black-owned business is 1.5% less likely, 1.5 percentage points more likely to never get a PPP loan. Right, so Black-owned firms conditional on applying actually are less likely to get a PPP loan. But what's really interesting is when you look at column 2. Column 2 is I'm going to focus on those applications that were only sent to conventional lenders. And there, amongst those ones, Black-owned businesses are actually 4 percentage points more likely to not receive a loan. On the other hand, if I look at column 4, where I'm looking at PPP loans that were only applications that were only sent to fintech lenders, there I see no gap in the probability of eventually getting a loan between Black-owned and non-Black-owned businesses, right? So what does this mean? Again, 2 things. Black-owned firms are less likely to get any PPP loan if it's sent to conventional lenders, but it's not the case if it's sent to a fintech lender. right? And so that means that lower applications rate do not fully explain the lower rates of conventional PPP loans for Black-owned firms. Even after getting sent there, you're less likely to get it. And again, this is conditional on all the controls that we've always added.
For conventional lenders, Johannes, do you know which branches they send to and whether the ratio of or the fraction of the Black borrowers in the before PPP?
Yeah,
branch? Does that information
no.
exist?
So I do not know which branch it gets processed. My actual guess is that for some of them, it just gets put in. Like if you, I don't know, if you're a very large bank, actually the largest banks don't work with Lendio, right? If you're, I don't know, Bank of America or something, you don't work with these platforms. So these will be like small to medium-sized banks. So one of the things you could maybe do is you say, well, a lot of these banks are actually very small. They have a very small footprint. So you're not going to be able to locate the branch precisely, but that borrower is it's like a metro area or something like that. It's really the coverage rate of some of these very small banks. So you could use the same racial animus thing maybe there. There's
What
also
about for approved loans. Do you know which branch approves the loan?
I do not know.
The
data just has the bank and it does not tell you the branch. Now, I would expect that for those firms that have branches, that it would be one of the branches that's close to the location of the borrower. And we know the location of the borrower, right? We know the exact address of the borrower. So that would be, I think, a plausible assumption if you wanted to do something there. But we definitely do not know that in the data.
Can I quickly clarify this chart here? So is this, because they apply to Lendio, this is Lendio, but then you're saying that they, on top, you said that this is businesses that rejected means they didn't get a PP loan anywhere.
That's right.
So is that what this represents? Because I think also in your paper, you said that somewhere around half of the people who applied to Lendio actually ended up, if they got a PPP loan, going somewhere else to get a PPP loan. So I'm just trying to understand whether this chart means conditional on all these things, that there's a lower chance of them getting a PPP loan anywhere.
So this exactly. So this no PPP loan here is literally business applies to Lendio. Lendio sent to at least one lender and never got a PPP loan from anyone. Like it just doesn't show up in the final loan data, right? And 35% of all loans that apply to Lendio and Lendio sent to at least one lender don't show up anywhere. Like they just never get a PPP loan. And so that's what we're looking at here. There's also, and I think this is what you're referring to, amongst the 65% that do get a PPP loan, not all of them will get it from the lender that Lendio sent it to. Some of them might get it from another lender. So what happened a lot at the time is that businesses were applying everywhere because they knew there were these capacity constraints. They knew like many of the loans wouldn't get processed. And they knew this deadline that you were just going to run out of the, in the end, they expanded the program. But you didn't know this for much of the time, right? So you knew, and the newspapers were reporting at the time, like the PPP program is going to run out after 5 days or something because so many firms are applying. And so what happened a lot is people applied to 10 different lenders at the same time. And so some of them all said, I'm also going to try Lendio, but I'm also going to call up my checking account bank. And I'm also going to do 5 other things because I really need this loan. I don't really care where it comes from. And so I'm going to try basically every bank that will talk to me. I'll put in an application and hope one of them gets through. And one of the specific things, one of the few checks that you had to make before originating a PPP loan was actually to make sure that this firm didn't already get a PPP loan from another lender, right? So the SBA had the system where you could check, the specific business and make sure that, this wasn't getting 5 PPP loans in parallel and using all of them. This was a program that was put together like over a space of 5 or 6 weeks with like complete chaos, obviously, around the world and, in the economy and so on. And so this is pretty chaotic times. Yes, I definitely know of small businesses that, were like on the phone for like many hours with their bank, or they were trying to get, and it was, and they were like, there were these forums you could find where like people would share like this bank still like has some capacity, i.e. they're like even responsive and so on. So I think there is a lot of interesting interesting thing. Like retrospectively, I think this program could have been done a lot more effectively, if it had not been designed, in the space of a few weeks with lots of other stuff also going on. Okay, so then the last part of the paper, and I'm not going to have the time to walk you through a lot of the details here. The question is like, can other things explain the disparities you observe? So the first one, I think, was the story one of you had raised before, that like banks prioritized existing clients, and maybe Black-owned businesses.
Sorry, Johannes, to slow you down.
No, not at all. I think the rest is not important. So we should, if there's questions, we should talk about it. Basically, the story is none of the other things you might have in mind play a role, and I would just rule it out. But if you trust me, we could just go straight to your questions.
In your previous table,
yes,
can you verify independently that the distribution is random along the dimension of race?
So yes, so it's good.
Send the loans to different platforms.
Yes, so we've done that. So if you put send to PPP on the left-hand side, you control for these, race doesn't show up. So that's exactly right. So it's yeah.
And also your baseline fixed effect controls for the locations as well.
It controls for the zip code location. That's right.
I see.
May I go back to the external validity question one more time?
Yes,
Johannes?
absolutely.
So I understand that when you compare PPP lending, those with automated process exhibit less race bias than the other. I understand that part. The question is, but that's because the PPP lending remove the concern about the default risk of farm lenders. In an alternative setting in which lenders are responsible, lender will suffer loss from default risk, and if somehow race is a predictor of default. Yeah. Which, condition on that may be socially inefficient. Nonetheless, from a lender point of view, it is a predictor.
Yes.
Is it possible that automation may be more efficient in finding proxies for race than human lenders, so that automation may not mitigate?
Yes. Yes. No, I mean, so let me just go back to the introduction, because I think that's exactly like, what do we take away from this? We're not saying automation is necessarily going to reduce racial disparities, right? What we're saying is automation can go two ways. Automation can amplify disparities, and that's exactly the mechanism you have in mind, right? The complex algorithm might lead to more statistical discrimination, right?
Yeah, but I'm not saying that PPP setting does not rule it out.
It does not rule out. No. I mean, in fact, I mean, I think we have good evidence that it does this too, right? So it goes in both ways. It has some ways through which it reduces, and then in other settings, it will have these other things that we have studied. You probably know the predictably unequal paper, and there's a few other papers that that show that this also plays a role, right? And so what I'm saying is, altogether, it's not like automation is either good or bad. Automation can have effects that make disparities worse, these complex algorithms, and I think those have been well studied in the literature. I think automation also has a bunch of mechanisms through which it can improve things. And I think we're showing that those play a role. Those will also play a role when, in addition, you have the other things. And then whether or not on net automation improves or reduces disparities is going to be an empirical question. But my sense is that much of the literature so far has largely focused on automation making disparities worse. And what we're saying is that these other mechanisms, where if you can shut down the channels through which they make it worse, you can also find evidence of other channels that are quantitatively important through which automation improves disparities. And so then it becomes, more of an empirical question, which of these two forces is more important? And that's going to differ by setting. So I don't think you can say automation is always good or always bad. It's just here we put on the table evidence that, it is likely to have a bunch of channels through which it'll reduce disparities. Those are going to be offset in most settings with credit risk by, that first bullet point. But on balance, it might still either improve or reduce, and you want to kind of study that balance, right?
Well, the last part was less sure, I guess, what I'm saying. So I mean, analogy would be like a college admission.
Yeah.
So if we completely automate college admission, would they improve or reduce minority admission rates? So
well, I mean, here's the thing. So the question is, I don't know, but let's take that, right? So let's assume you had a race proxy that predicted success at going to college, right? So assume that was the case, but also assume that human admissions officers have some actual biases, right? Now, if you automated it, what would happen? Well, one force would be you take the human out of the process, and you would reduce racial discrimination in college admissions by that mechanism. But maybe the computer would be so good at predicting who's successful, and maybe that does truly correlate with race, that would push the other way. And again, which of these two forces would dominate in the end, I think, is an empirical question. Right? I think that's really the way I think about it. You have two forces. You have, the human biases that would lead to more discrimination, and maybe you have the inability without the complex algorithms to fully predict who's successful. And if that truly is correlated with race, then it might make it worse, right? And again, but I think the point here is that there is a plausible and quantitatively large mechanism that might make it better. And so you can't, even though you can have the better predict default or whatever story, that doesn't mean that on net it's going to be worse. And so that's the way that I think about this. Okay. All right, I think this is actually a great place to stop, because I think you've kind of got the picture of what we're after. If you want to see how we rule out some of these other stories, you can have a look at the paper. But I think this kind of bigger picture, like what do we take away from this at a high level, I think is kind of a great place to start. So I'm going to stop right here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Johannes. Very interesting paper. Any more questions to Johannes? I think we still have kind of 2 more minutes. Yeah, Professor Wei, please.
No, this is this.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Great. Well, thank you very much.
A question on how much of this might be a story of just fintech might be faster, right? Which again is coincident with your general view that fintech may be better in this application or automation. But since you mentioned that people are applying to different platforms, right? All at the same time, maybe fintech is just faster.
So I think fintech will be faster, but I also so I do think fintech will be faster, but I also think that let me think about that. I mean, I think it is going to be true that fintech is faster, but I don't see why that should lead to like racial differences, right? Like if it's faster for everybody, then it'll just have more loans, but it won't have disproportionately more loans to Black-owned firms. Right?
That Black-owned firms might be at the back of the line, and in ways even beyond those 4 or 5 control variables that you have.
So I think, so that could be true. I mean, I think one of the things that we can do, in these regressions that we control for approval week fixed effects, and in fact for these ones here, we actually not just have the approval week, but we have also the application week fixed effect. Right, so this is like conditional on applying literally at this, in the same week, which would, which I think in terms of speed would put you to the back of the line. So for the ones where we see the application, we can control when you applied for, and it doesn't seem to at least wipe it out entirely. Overall, my sense is like that story is not that different to these, fewer capacity constrained, lower fixed cost, just faster. So, and sometimes you can say, look, one of the benefits of fintech is they can just lend to everybody. They can do it fast, efficiently, quickly, at scale. And then, when you can lend to everybody, you lend to everybody, and you don't pick, and your biases don't play a role. If you can't lend to everybody because of capacity constraints, then, who you going to process first is going to be where your biases show up. So I don't view this lending story as like problematic. I think it's sort of broadly in line with this bigger story that I think, we want to tell about what's going on here.
You mentioned that the Biden modification of the program, is it under the Biden version? Is it the new PPP should be only lent to minority business, or should increase the weight on minority borrowers? If the latter, I wonder whether if the fintech companies do not modify their programs, could they end up, being sort of offering less favor? Does not increase the weight as much on minority borrowers than the conventional lenders.
It's a good question. I'd have to go back and look at the exact language. My recollection is that it is it is gone like largely to minority-owned businesses. Now, if there isn't a ton of PPP money left, after this period, anyways. But yeah, so I'd have to go back and look exactly at the text. But my understanding was that it is like very substantially skewed towards minority business. I don't know if it's like impossible to make a loan to a non-minority business afterwards, but it is sufficiently strong that like it becomes useless from like the perspective we have. And it comes back to your like external validity story, right? Once you're in a setting where there's a big focus on race and who you lend to, it's no longer externally valid for like normal loans. At least for the other stuff, race wasn't as much of wasn't a factor in like what they were being told to do. And so and so then you can kind of think that there's at least some things you can take away to other settings where race also isn't explicitly part of the mandate. But once race becomes an explicit part of the mandate, it becomes very difficult to think about this question.
How does it work then?
It is possible.
Ratio.
Yeah. Sorry, Hongjun, go ahead.
Sorry, it just follow up on your question. They put the ratio variable as a priority?
Yeah, so I think, for example, the way they did it is they only, the only lenders that were allowed to still make PPP loans after this modification were these like minority deposit banks. So it was like a specific set of banks with a specific, so in the US already we have these. It's actually interesting, these minority deposit institution and also these CDFI like non-profit type banks, which are sort of, financial institutions specifically set up to provide financial services to underserved communities. And those were the only ones that were still eligible to grant PPP loans afterwards. So, the large banks were basically out.
And some of which are fintech lenders?
Some of which I think are fintech, yes. So I think you could be a minority deposit or a CDFI that's a fintech.
So if, as Shangjin conjectured, they didn't adjust their algorithm, they will be violating the rule in some sense, right?
I mean, again, so you mean the minority ones?
Only lend to minority owners.
Yeah. So, but this is again where I guess my answer is I don't know explicitly what the law says. Does it say only banks that are like if you're a minority deposit institution or a CDFI, are you legally prohibited from lending to non-minority owned businesses? I don't think that's the case. I think it's just the entire setup, the relationships they have with the minority communities and so on. So that's why I don't think, again, I have to go back to the law. I don't recall it being it is illegal to lend to a non-minority business, but it is banks whose mission statement is to lend to minority businesses that were the only ones remaining in the PPP program. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. This was
Thank
fun.
you very much.
And have a good night for everyone in China.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Johannes. Thanks, everyone, for participation.